Good afternoon. This is the black man who reads aloud, and I am reading the story of Sam McAllum, an ex-slave, 95 years old, was interviewed in Meridian, Mississippi by Marjorie Woods Austin. 95 years old. 95 years old. And I hope that we get to get an understanding of this is the Federal Writers Project. Meridian, Mississippi. Meridian, Mississippi, Mr. and Mr. Excuse me, Mr. Sam McAllum. To those familiar with the history of Bloody Kemper, as recorded, the following narrative from the lips of an eyewitness will be hearsay. But the subject of this autobiography, carrying his 95 years more timely than many a man of 60, is declared sound of mind as well as body by the Hector Carey family, prominent in Mississippi, for whom Sam McAllum has worked in a position of great trust and responsibility for 50 years or more. While this old Negro may be mistaken at some points the universal failing of witnesses, his impressions are certainly not more involved than the welter of local records. Mrs. Carey states that if Sam said he saw a thing happen thus, it may be depended upon that he is telling exactly what he really saw. Sam McAllum, an ex-slave, lives in Meridian, Lauderdale County. Sam is 5'3" tall and weighs 140 pounds. The first town I'd ever seen was DeKalb in Kemper County. The Stevenson's plantation is where I was born, about 13 miles north of DeKalb. I was born the 2nd of September in 1842. My mammy belonged to the Stevensons, and my pappy belonged to Master Louis Barnes. His plantation wasn't very far from the Stevensons. The Stevensons and the Barneses were kind white folk. My pappy was an old man when I was born. I was a baby child. After he died, my mammy married a McCollum nigger. There was about 30 slaves at Stevenson. My mammy worked in the field, and her mammy, Lily, was the yard woman. She looked after all the little colored children. I don't recollect any playthings us had except a ball my young master gave me. His name was Sam Louis Stevenson, about my age. The little colored children play a blind man or hiding and just whatever come to him. My young master learned me out of his speller, but mistress whooped me. She said I didn't need to learn nothing except how to count so as I could feed the mules without colicking them. You give them 10 years of corn to the mule. If you give more, it'll colic them and they die. That's cause more than a nigger would. That was the first whipping I'd ever got, and when me and my young master was spelling. I stayed with him special, but I waited on all the white folks chilling at Stevenson. I carried the foot tub in at night and washed their foots. And I pulled in the trunkle bed out from under the other bed. All the boys slept in the same room. I was a yard boy and waited on the master and the mistress. Hadn't been to the field then, hadn't worked yet. Mr. Stevenson was a surveyor, and he fell out with Mr. McAllum and had a lawsuit. He had to pay it in dockets. Mr. Callum had to privilege of taking me and my mammy and another woman on her too. He took us. So us come to the McAllum plantation to live. It were in Kemper too, about 8 miles from Stevenson's. Us come there and during the war. That's where my mammy married one of the McAllum niggers. My new pappy went to the war with Mr. McAllum and was with him when he was wounded at Mama's Gap battle. He brung him home to die, and he done it. Then the Yankees come through the Cobb hunting up cannons and guns and mules. They sure did eat a heap. Us hit all the best things like silver and drive the stocks to the swamp. They didn't burn nothing, but us heard tell of burning in Scuba and Meridian. I were plowing a mule, and the Yankees made me take him out. That's the last I seen of that mule, and he was headed for Scuba with 3 Yankees straddling of him. Times were tight, not a grain of coffee and not much else. When us clothes were plumb wore out, the missus and the niggers, women's, made us some out of cotton us had raised. My granny stayed in the loom room all the time. The other women's done the spinning and she done the weaving. She was a good one. The M&O, the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, were burning wood then. They couldn't get coal. They used taller pots instead of oil. The engineer had to climb out of the engine fist himself and tend to them taller pots. They do different now. There was so much scarcity of men, they was putting them in the war at 65. But the war in for they called the list. Mistress didn't have nobody to help her in doing the war. She had to do the best she could. When she heard the niggas talking about being free, she wore 'em out with a cowhide. She warn't a powerful woman. Neither. She had to do it herself, 'cause 'twa'n't nobody gonna do it for her. They want nothing a nigger could do but stand up and take it. Some folks treated their slaves mighty bad, but the nigger dogs put the nigger dogs on them. All my white folks was good to slaves according to how good the niggers behaved themselves. Of course, you wouldn't leave the plantation without a pass and the patroller get you. I ain't counting that, 'cause that was something everybody knew beforehand. There was a heap of talk about the Yankees giving every nigger 40 acres and a mule. I don't know how us come to hear about it. It just kind of got around. I picked out my mule. All of us did. Times were mighty tough. Us thought we no trouble in during the war. Us didn't know nothing about trouble. There were so many slaves at McAllum, they had to thin them out. Mistress put us out. She sent me to Mr. Scott close to Scuba. I was most a grown boy by then, and I could plow pretty good. Come to surrender, Mr. Scott say, "Sambo, I don't have to pay your missus for you no more. I have to pay you if you stay. Niggas is free. You is free." I didn't believe it. I worked that crop out, but I didn't ask for no pay. That didn't seem right. I didn't understand about freedom, so I went home to my old missus. She said, "Sambo, you don't belong to me now. They bound us Negroes out. They sent me and my brother to a man that was going to give us some learning along with the farming. His name was Overstreet. Us worked that crop out, but us ain't never seen no speller nor nothing. Then us went back to the Stevensons where us was born to get us age. Old missus say, "Sambo, you ain't 21 yet." She cried, cause I had to go back to Mr. Overstreet, but I didn't. My mammy and me went back to McAllen's and stayed until a man gives us a patch in turn for us. He pinned him on his farm. I know about the Ku Kluxes. I seen them. But the first time I seen them was the last. Ain't nobody know exactly about them Ku Kluxes. Some say it was a spirit that had no water since the war. One rider would drink 4 or 5 gallons at a time, kept us a toting buckets fast as us could carry them. It was a spirit, a evil spirit. But folks they ain't acted right, liable to be found most anything tied up somewheres. The niggas was having a party one Saturday night on Hampton's plantation. Come some men on horses with some kind of scared faces on them. They was all whooped up, disguised. The horses were scared up too. They called for Miller Hampton. He was one of the Hampton niggas. He been up to something. I don't know what he done, but they say he done something. They didn't have no trouble getting him because us was all scared. Us get killed too. They carried him off with them and they killed him that very night. Us went to the Cobb the next day in a drove and asked the white folks to help us. Us buy all the ammunition us could get to take to the spirit because we was having another party the next week. They didn't come to that party. I don't know why they don't have no Ku Kluxes now. The spirit still had the same power. Then I go to work for Mr. McAllum in the car when I ain't working for the Gullies. Mr. Ed was my young master, you know, and now he was the jailer in the Cobb. I know the Chisholms too. That's how come I seen all I seen and knows what I ain't never been told. I couldn't tell you about that. I the only one still living that was grown and right there and seen it happen. I ain't scared now. Nothing could happen to me for telling. Mr. Carey done seen to that, and I just ain't never told. Them that belonged to my race was scared to tell. Maybe it was all for the best. That was a long time ago. They give out things then that way wanted to sound, and that's the way they done come down. It started with Mr. John Gully getting shot. Now, Mr. Gully was a leading man amongst them white Democratic people in Kemper, but they ain't had much chance for about 7 years. I just remember just how long on account of white folks like the Chisholms run everything. Everybody was sure it was some of the Chisholms crowd. But some folks know it was that nigga Walter Raleigh that shot Mr. John Gully. But ain't nobody ever told them, show enough reason why Walter shot John Gully. The Chisholms warned the Yankees, but they warned the white Democratic people. They do say the Chisholms and folks like them used to run around with the Yankees. Maybe that's how come they was different. Even before the Yankees come at all, Mr. Chisholm was on us side. He was loud-mouthing about it. Mr. John Gully, he got helped Mr. Chisholm get to be a judge, but he turned out to be the worse than the judge than he had to judge. Mr. John Gully and the others made him resign. I reckon that's why he quit being a Democratic mouth and started ructions with Mr. Gully. Come to the surrender, Mr. Chisholm, he got to be the big leader on the other side, and he seen to it that a lot of the white Democratic men got kept from voting, and a lot of the niggas step up and voting like he told them. They were scared not to. So the Chisholms kept getting all the big places. A lot of the widows and folks like that who couldn't help themselves their homes, they lost their homes and everything they had. The papers the grand jury make out about it was stored in the sheriff's office. The sheriff give out that his office had been broken open and all the papers stole. Then Mr. Chisholm's brother got himself appointed sheriff and made Mr. Chisholm deputy. That's when he started running things, sure enough. Next thing you know, Mr. Chisholm is sure enough sheriff himself. Then they gathered all his kinfolks around, and they make out a black lie, a list. The folks' names on it were the ones that the Chisholm didn't need. It would talk around that the first name on that list was Mr. John Gully's name. A heap of old Ku Klux's names were on that list too. Mr. Chisholm sent the Ku Klux's name to the governor and expect him to do something about running them out. But of course he couldn't do nothing about that, except because it was a spirit. But even now, then somebody, what's names on that list, got shot in the back. Before election come in November, it must have been in 75, that niggas had been voting and doing everything that Chisholm say. They were still hopping back to that 40 acres and a mule that they was promised, what they never got. It was turning out to be just some thing that everything else that Mr. Chisholm had been promising to give them. They ain't never got none of it. The white Democratic folks then won that election. Soon Mr. Chisholm run for something or another and got beat bad. Then he was mad as sure enough. He went to Jackson to see governor about it. Soon a heap of old white Democratic men in Kemper got arrested for something or another. Then Mr. John Gully got shot and everybody was sure the Chisholms had done it. Everybody was that mad. Chisholm and them had to go to court, but they was slippery as eels, and Mr. Walter Riley's name come out. He were a nigger. They give out at the trial that Walter was hired to shoot him by the Chisholm folk. That was not the reason, but there was blood for folks' eyes by that time. It got worse that Saturday when Mr. Gully was buried. Folks all over Kemper done heard about it by now, and by 9 o'clock Sunday morning, people was coming in over the road led to the cob. They all had loaded guns. It was on a Sunday when all the killing happened. I mean, the winding up killing. I was there before a gun was fired. I was there when the first men was wounded. The colored people had gathered in the cob at the Methodist church. They hadn't a gun fired yet. Mr. Henry Gully goes to the colored people's church. He walked in the front door and took his hat off and off his head. They was packed in that house for a preaching. He walked down the aisle till he got in front of the old preacher and they turned sideways and speak. I want to ask you to dismiss your congregation. There is going to be some trouble take place right here in the cob, and I don't want any colored persons to get hurt. The preacher rises to his feet, and every nigger in the house were up, and he dismisses them. Mr. Henry Gully was Mr. John Gully's brother and a leading man of the right. The town was a milling with folks from everywhere. Chisholm and them got into jail for safety, and Miss Cornelia Chisholm went backwards and forwards to the jail. They thought she was carrying ammunition in her clothes for her father. Mr. McClendon, he was one of them, was with her Twix. He was on the right-hand side. Some believed he was the one that killed John Gully. They told him they burn his house down if he stay in it. But he said, but if he go to the jail, they give him a fair trial. Well, Mr. McClendon was shot downside Miss Cornelia. I seen it when they fell on his face. The man that fired the gun turned him over and says, well, us got him. Miss Cornelius run to the jail where the balance of the family were. Them outside says, boy, it'll never do. They all ain't in there yet. Let's send them to Scuba and get Charlie Rosenbaum and John Gilmore to come help their friends. They belongs to the Chisholm crowd, and we want them too, so they come. Somebody says, let's commence right here. I ain't never seen a battle before, but I sure seen one then. It was like this. Mr. Cal Hall was the only Democratic white friend Mr. Rosenbaum had. He stood twixt his white Democratic friends and Mr. Rosenbaum. He put his arms over Mr. Rosenbaum and said, boys, he's a friend of mine. If you kill him, you kill me. Mr. Rosenbaum crawled over the courthouse wall and squatted down and stayed there. Mr. Hall stood over him, protecting him. But Mr. John Gilmore make for the jail, and when they opened the door for him, the shooting started. Right then where Mr. Gilmore got his, Miss Cornelius was struck in the wrist and mortified in after a while, and she died from it. I know I ain't told the show enough reason Mr. John Gully got killed. Maybe the time has come for the truth to be told. Hope won't nobody think hard of me for telling. Mr. John Gully had a bar room and a clerk, a white man by the name of old Bob Dabbs, walk beneath the counter. This nigga Walter Ryder I was telling you about a while ago was a courting a yellow woman. They weren't so many of them in them days. Mr. Dabbs said, Walter, if I ever caught you walking with, he called that yellow woman's name, I'll give you the worst beating ever was. Walter was caught with her again. That Friday night, he comes strutting into the bar room. Mr. Dabbs says, come help me move those boxes here in the next room. Walker walked in like a nigger will when he asked him to do something, and Mr. Dabbs turned the key. Get across them good boxes, he says. I'll give you what I promise you. Mr. Dabbs got a piece of plank and burned Walter up. All this here was going on about this, at the time the niggers was a voting and doing things around white folks. They thought they was protected by the Chisholm crowd. The next Friday night, Walter walked right into that bar room again. Mr. Dabbs said, what you doing here, nigger? Walter said, you remember what you done to me tonight 1 week? He says, well, what's to it? Then Walter says, well, I come to settle with you. Mr. Dabbs said, let me see if I can hurry you up some. And he reached his hand back and he reached to his hip. But before he could draw out, Walter done run back to the door. There was a chinaberry tree close to the door, and Walter got behind it and fired a pistol. Mr. Dabbs was hit with his arm and laying across the counter with his pistol in his hand. And me and Mr. Ed, because he was the jailer, we put him on a mattress in the room on the bar. He died that night. The word just kind of got round that some of the Chisholm crowd done killed Mr. Gully's clerk. Well, Walter run off to Mississippi. Mr. Gully was pursuing after him to catch him. Walter sure got tired of him pursuing after him. There was the evidence Walter give out for they put the rope on his neck and start him on his way to the gallows, but nobody dared to put it down just like it were. Mr. Sinclair was the sheriff by this time, and my young massa and me went with him to get Walter to take him into the gallows. Mr. Sinclair said, Ed, you going to the jailhouse now, and here's a half a pint of whiskey. Give it to Walter, make him happy. Then if he talk too much, nobody will believe it. Mr. Ed says, come on, Sambo, go with me. He reached down and got a handful of goobers and put it in his pocket. We were eating them on the way to the jailhouse. He says, Walter, Mr. Sinclair done sent you a dram. Walter says, Mr. McAllum, I sees you and Sam eating peanuts coming along. Just you give me a handful of them and I'll eat them on the way to the gallows. I don't want no whiskey. Then us got in the wagon. I see Walter now standing there with his cap on the back of his head, ready to pull out over his eyes. After he gets there, There's a powerful crowd round that wagon. Then comes a rider from Scuba, pulls the paper out of his pocket and hands it to Mr. Sinclair. He read it and said, let them people go on to the gallows. The wagon turned around and go back to the jail. The governor has stopped the hanging till the case get investigated. The people standing there waiting for Walter to be hung didn't know what was the matter. They placed Walter back in jail in his coffin along with him. The lawyers would visit him to get his testimony. They showed him his coffin already and asked him, did he do the killing or not? They wanted him to say he was hired to do it. They fixed it all up. Nobody to say just how it was. I was married by this time to Laura. She was the nursemaid to Mr. J.H. Carey. She's been dead 20 years now. When